There are 8 bluegill living in a tank in the basement of a water treatment plant south of San Francisco. Nobody fishes for them. They are on duty. Sensors watch them around the clock. When those fish breathe, when they flex their gills to cough out something they do not like, that movement gets read by a machine and turned into a number. If enough of them show distress at once, an alarm trips, a water sample gets pulled automatically, and somebody's pager lights up. New York City runs the same kind of setup. So does Washington, in the District of Columbia. The system was developed in cooperation with the United States Army. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection has reported that its bluegill caught a diesel spill about 2 hours before any of the electronic detection gear in that building noticed a thing. 2 hours ahead of the machines. The man who co-founded the company that builds the system said it about as plainly as it can be said. There is no man-made sensor that does the same job as a bluegill. So let me ask you something. You have called this a kid's fish your whole life. A fish you catch on a bobber while you wait for something serious to bite. And 3 of the biggest cities in America trust its nervous system to guard the drinking water of millions of people. Which one of you has been underestimating the other? I have watched anglers work bluegill water for a lot of years, and almost every piece of August advice going around makes the same mistake. It treats August like a depth problem. Go deeper. Find the cool band between the hot surface and the dead bottom. Depth is part of it, but depth answers a question hardly anybody actually asks. The real question is this: which animal are you fishing for? Because a 6-inch bluegill and a 10-inch bluegill are not one fish at 2 sizes. They eat different food, they live in different parts of the lake, they run completely different risks, and they are not even on the same life plan. Once that lands, your tackle box sorts itself into 2 piles, and one of those piles has been quietly costing you the best fish in the water. So today, 15 August bluegill baits. Everyone gets a filter rating from me, my rough measure of how well that bait screens out the little ones. And number 1 is not a bait at all. It costs nothing, and it is the only item here that makes next August better than this one. One thing first. Panfish rules change state to state and sometimes lake to lake. Bag limits, bed fishing seasons, what you may use for bait and where you may move it. Check your state and local regulations before you fish any of this. Now let me show you the 2 fish. In the 1980s, a researcher named Mart Gross studied bluegill at Lake Opinicon in Ontario, at the Queen's University Biological Station, and quietly rewired how biologists understand this species. Male bluegill are not running one life plan, they are running 2, and a male gets locked into his before he is old enough to spawn. The first is the parental male. He waits, he grows. At Lake Opinicon, those parental males did not mature until around 7 years old. Then he sweeps out a nest, courts a female, guards the eggs, fans them clean, and defends the whole operation with his body. The second is what biologists call the cuckolder. That male matures at around 2 years old and never builds anything. As a young fish, he uses a sneaking tactic, darting into another male's nest at the moment of spawning to steal a fertilization. As he grows, he shifts to a satellite tactic, taking on the coloring and posture of a female, so the parental male lets him hover right over the eggs. Sit with that. The 10-inch slab you have been chasing is a 7-year-old or older animal that took the slow road, and a lake only produces so many. The little ones swarming your bobber may be fully grown adults on a completely different plan who were never going to get that big. That is the first thing the tackle industry has no reason to tell you. There is no product in it. You cannot bottle a life history strategy or hang it on a peg. Now the second piece, and this one comes from Michigan. Earl Werner and Donald Hall, working out of Michigan State, spent years using bluegill as the test animal for what ecologists call optimal foraging. In 1988, they published the finding that explains almost everything about where bluegill sit in August. Small bluegill hide in the weeds, not because the weeds feed them well. Open water feeds them better. Werner and Hall ran pond experiments and measured it. For a small bluegill, the risk of being eaten by a largemouth bass out in open water was something like 40 to 80 times greater than inside the vegetation. So the little ones are hostages. They are paying a food tax to stay alive. The big ones stop paying it. Once a bluegill gets past a certain size, bass can no longer eat him easily, and at that moment he is free to leave the salad and go feed where the food actually is. And the exact size where that switch happened changed from lake to lake, depending on how many bass lived there. Read what that means. The big ones did not leave the bank because August got hot. They left years ago, the day they got big enough to be safe out there. Heat only decides what depth they use once they are out. The advice telling you the giants went deep because of the thermocline has the cause and the effect backwards. And it gets one more thing wrong, and it is a big one. Everybody tells you the beds are done by August. Bluegill are what biologists call fractional spawners. They do not spawn once and quit. The Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources notes they spawn multiple times through the summer at lower latitudes. The North Dakota Game and Fish Department notes multiple spawns in a season are common. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service describes them as colony spawners, with 50 or more males nesting in one place. So across a great deal of this country, in August, some of the largest parental males in the lake are sitting in 1 to 4 feet of water on a saucer of clean sand, guarding it, while everybody who watched a summer fishing video is out over a brush pile in 20 feet. Hold that, we are coming back to it hard. Before the list, the idea that ties all 15 baits together. I call it the filter. Most people believe that if you want big bluegill and not little ones, you go smaller. Tinier jig, tinier hook, sneak it past them. That is backwards, and you already know it from your own fishing. A smaller bait does not select for big fish. It selects for any fish with a mouth. The 4-inch bluegill beats the 10-inch one to your bait every time, because he is hungrier, he is shallower, he is in a school of 200, and he has less to lose. If you want to filter, you do not make the bait smaller, you make it harder to eat. 3 ways. Make the profile longer than a small fish can engulf. Widen the hook gap so a small mouth cannot get around it. Or, move the bait horizontally, fast enough that a small fish cannot catch it, and a big one can. A bluegill's suction power and burst speed both scale up hard with body size. The little ones simply cannot make the play. Group 1. Food that falls out of the sky. August is the peak month for land insects hitting the water. Ants, beetles, hoppers, moths, whatever the wind knocks off the hardwoods along the bank. And bluegill are built to eat things that fall. Number 15. The foam ant. Filter rating, low to medium. There are days in August, usually warm and humid, when an ant colony puts up a flight and a great many end up on the water. The angler standing on the downwind bank under a line of oaks when that happens will have the day of his year. A black foam ant, sized to a fingernail, on the lightest line you own, cast into the drift line where the surface film has collected foam and bits of leaf. Do not work it. That is the whole trick. Let it sit dead still, exactly like a drowning insect that has stopped struggling. Number 14. The foam spider on a casting bubble. Filter rating, medium. Every bluegill angler gets told fly gear is the real answer for surface bugs. It is a fine tool. It also costs a couple $100 and takes a season to learn. You do not need it. A clear plastic casting bubble, partly filled with water for casting weight, a couple feet of light leader, and a foam spider. You now have fly rod reach and fly rod presentation, with the spinning rod already in your hand. Watch the filter work. A 5-inch bluegill will slap at a surface bug over and over and never get it. A 9-inch one comes up once and it is gone. Nobody sells you that, because a casting bubble is a piece of plastic that costs $1 and lasts 20 years. There is no spring campaign for it. Number 13. The live cricket, free-lined. Filter rating, medium. Crickets are not new advice, but almost everybody rigs it wrong for August, hanging it under a bobber, which pins it at one depth and drags it with every ripple. Try it with no float and no weight at all. Hook the cricket lightly through the collar so it stays kicking. Cast under the overhanging limbs, and let it sink on a completely slack line. It drifts down at the exact speed a real drowned cricket drifts down, because it is one. That sink rate is the presentation, and a float destroys it. Number 12. The tiny surface popper. Filter rating, high. Now we are hunting. The smallest hard-bodied popper that still makes a real sound, fished along a shady bank in the first hour of light or the last hour of it. You will catch far fewer fish on this than on a waxworm. That is the point. Only fish with the size and confidence to commit to a surface target will come, and when a 10-inch bull comes up on a popper, you will hear it across the cove. Number 11. The hopper and dropper. Filter rating, medium to high. Same casting bubble, foam hopper on top, tiny jig hanging about 2 feet beneath it. 2 depths at once. The hopper is a strike target and a strike indicator at the same time, and the jig underneath covers the fish looking up, but not all the way up. If the hopper twitches sideways and does not go under, that is a fish on the dropper. Lift, do not swing. That is the sky food. Now the sun climbs, the bugs quit falling, and the whole game moves out into open water. Group 2. Food that drifts in the water column. This is where Werner and Hall pay you back. The big bluegill left the weeds to eat suspended food over open water. So in the middle of an August day, the biggest fish in the lake are very often not on structure at all. They are hanging in clear water over nothing, at whatever depth the food and the temperature agree on. That is hard to accept, because open water gives you nothing to aim at. Everybody would rather fish a brush pile. A brush pile feels like fishing. Suspended fish over a featureless flat feels like guessing. Number 10. The Bear Micro Jig, hovered. Filter rating, medium. A small jig head, no plastic, no bait, just the hook, in a color you can see from above. Count it down, then hold it dead still. The natural sway of your rod tip is all the action it needs. Number 9. The Hair Jig, swum horizontally. Filter rating, high. Hair jigs are taught as a hang and quiver bait. Do the opposite. Cast out over open water, count it down, and swim it back on a slow, steady horizontal pull with no pauses at all. That horizontal move is the filter. The soft hair keeps breathing the whole way, so the bait never stops looking alive, but a small bluegill cannot chase it down and get its mouth around it. A big one runs it over. Number 8. The 2-inch soft minnow on a light head. Filter rating, high. Here is a thing even good anglers underrate. Big bluegill eat fish, not as their main food, but the biggest ones absolutely hunt small bait fish, and when they do, you are fishing for a predator, not a bug picker. Swim it along the outside edge of a weed line. Fewer bites, bigger average. Number 7. The Micro Flutter Spoon. Filter rating, high. A tiny metal spoon dropped over open water and fluttered back up. It flashes, it falls sideways, and it is heavy enough to work a whole column fast and find the depth the fish are using. Find the level with it, then bring in something slower. Number 6. The long line drift with a piece of nightcrawler. Filter rating, medium to high. This one is close to free, and almost nobody does it anymore. Casting bubble, a long light leader, a plain small hook, one piece of nightcrawler with the ends left loose to move. Let the boat drift with the wind and let that rig trail well behind you. You are covering open water at a natural speed, with a natural bait at a natural depth. When the wind is up in August, this beats anchored fishing badly, and the rig costs about $1. While we are out here, one thing about weed beds that most people have backwards. Everybody knows a summer weed bed can go low on oxygen. Almost nobody thinks through when. Submerged plants photosynthesize all day and put oxygen into the water while they do it. So inside a healthy green weed bed, dissolved oxygen climbs through the afternoon and is often highest in the last few hours of daylight. It crashes overnight, when those same plants stop producing and start consuming, which is why a weed bed before sunrise on a hot August morning can be the deadest water on the lake. Same weed bed, different place at different hours. Dead before dawn. A feeding station at 5 in the evening. Nobody sells you that either. Now we go back to the bank, and this is the part I think most of you have never been told. Group 3. The beds everyone swears are finished. In much of this country, August still has active bluegill colonies. Not the huge coordinated push of late spring, but repeat waves, smaller and scattered, with the largest parental males on them. Here is how you find them with no electronics. Walk or idle the shallow flats with the sun high and polarized glasses on, and look for clusters of clean circles on the bottom, roughly dinner plate sized, sand or fine gravel, swept free of silt so they read as lighter patches against darker bottom. Where you find one, you will find dozens, because these fish nest in colonies. And there is a piece of old angler lore here I want to hand you honestly. Plenty of southern bank fishermen will tell you that you can smell an active bluegill colony from downwind, a distinct sweet melon sort of odor. I have heard it from a lot of people with no reason to lie about it. I have not found a study that documents it. Take it as folk knowledge worth testing, not as science. Number 5. The small tube dropped straight into the nest. Filter rating, very high. The highest filter bait on this list. A 1-inch tube on a plain light hook. No weight, lowered straight down into the saucer. You are not feeding him. He is guarding. A parental male will pick up trash and carry it off the nest, and he will attack anything he reads as a threat to the eggs. Drop it in, let it sit, and he will either move it or kill it. Either way, your line goes tight. Only the nesting male is on that saucer, and by definition, he is the biggest class of fish in that shallow water. Number 4. The small inline spinner across the colony edge. Filter rating, high. Rather than dropping into one nest, run it along the outside boundary of the colony, parallel to the bank. The blade thump reads as an intruder cruising the neighborhood, and the males peel off to intercept it. You find out fast how many are home. Number 3. The tight-lined worm on bottom, no float. Filter rating, medium. A small piece of worm, a plain hook, the lightest split shot that will hold, laid on hard, clean bottom near the colony, with the line just barely tight. A float lifts the bait off bottom and puts a bobbing distraction over the fish's head. The biggest fish in shallow August water are looking down at their nest, not up at the sky. Number 2 is not really a bait. It is how the bait gets there, and it is the most underrated tool in American panfish fishing. Number 2. The long telescopic pole. The cane pole your grandfather used, in modern form. Filter rating, high. Here is the problem with everything I just told you about beds. To fish a colony in 3 feet of clear water, you have to put a bait into a spot the size of a dinner plate without the fish knowing you exist. A cast does that badly. The line lands first, the lure slaps, the colony scatters, and you have burned 12 nests to fish one. A long telescopic pole solves it. 10, 12, 16 feet of pole, a fixed length of line, and you reach out and set the bait into the exact circle you chose. Nothing lands. Nothing splashes. No line drags across 4 other nests on the way in, and you will not see this pushed anywhere because there is no money in it, no reel, no drag system, no gear ratio, no bearing count, nothing that gets redesigned every season. A tube of fiberglass that costs about $20 and lasts 20 years. No upgrade path, so no marketing. Before number 1, let me kill a myth that is doing real damage. You have been told to fish for bluegill after dark, under the dock lights, late night. That advice is borrowed from crappie and catfish and glued onto the wrong species. Bluegill are a daytime animal. Work going back to Davis in the 1960s and Reynolds and Casterlin in the 1970s measured bluegill activity around the clock and found them roughly twice as active in daylight as in darkness. And think about why. At night, the walleye is hunting. The catfish is hunting. The bass is hunting. A bluegill in open water after dark is not a predator, he is a menu item, so he tucks into cover and waits it out. He is not refusing to eat because he is not hungry. He is refusing because eating is how you get eaten. Which means the best window in August is not midnight. It is the last 2 hours of daylight, when the weed bed oxygen has climbed all day, when the wind has been knocking bugs off the trees since noon, and when the fish can still see. And now, number 1. It is not a bait. It costs nothing. And it is the only thing here that changes what your lake looks like next August. Number 1 is the empty space you leave in your bucket. Stay with me, because there is hard data behind this, and it contradicts something most of us believed our whole lives. We all grew up hearing that bluegill overpopulate and stunt, so the more you keep, the better the fishing gets. 25 fish limits exist because of that belief. Andrew Reipel, who did this work as a research biologist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and is now a professor at the University of California, Davis, tested it. In a study published in 2015, Wisconsin cut the daily panfish bag limit from 25 down to 10 on 7 lakes, and paired each with a control lake where the old limit stayed. The lakes with the reduced limit produced bigger bluegill. Average length went up about 20 millimeters, call it just under an inch, compared to the controls. Just under an inch does not sound like much until you understand what an inch means on a bluegill. Reipel has made the point that as these fish get longer, they get disproportionately heavier, so a smaller limit of larger fish can put more actual meat in your pan than a full stringer of small ones. Read that again. The reduced limit may hand you more fish to eat, not less. And look back at what Gross found. The truly big fish are the parental males, the ones that took 7 years to get there and then built and guarded the nests. When we hammer the biggest fish in a colony, we remove exactly the individuals the population needs to make more big fish. Reipel has pointed to fishing pressure on spawning beds as a serious factor in the long-term decline in panfish size. So here is number 1, plainly. Keep a mess of the medium ones. Eat them, they are outstanding. But when a true slab comes over the side, look at how old that animal is. Look at what he is doing in August, and think hard before he goes in the bucket. Nobody makes $1 telling you that. There is no product called restraint. It does not come in a package. It does not get a new color for spring, and no clerk earns anything by mentioning it, which is exactly why you have never heard it from anywhere with something to sell. So let me put the whole day together. First light through mid-morning, fish the sky. Downwind banks, overhanging hardwoods, foam lines, casting bubble and a surface bug, or a free-lined cricket. Mid-morning through mid-afternoon, go out and fish nothing. Open water, suspended, no structure. Microspoon to find the depth, then the hair jig swum horizontally, or a long line drift with a piece of crawler. Mid-afternoon on, walk the shallow flats and read the bottom. If there are clean saucers, the biggest shallow fish are on them. Telescopic pole, tube in the circle, and be quiet about it. Last 2 hours of daylight, the weed bed edge, when the oxygen in there has climbed all day. That is your best window, and almost nobody uses it, because everyone is either home for dinner or waiting for dark. The legal and safety side, which matters more here than in most videos. Bed fishing for panfish is restricted or closed in some places. Bag and size limits vary widely, and some states have recently tightened them. Never move live bait or live fish from one body of water to another. Never mix household chemicals to make a bait scent. Wash your hands after handling lead sinkers and keep them away from children. And check your state and local regulations before you fish, because what is legal on one lake may not be legal on the next one over. Now let me come back to those 8 fish in the basement in San Francisco. We call bluegill simple. We hand them to kids. We file them under fish you catch while waiting for a real one. And then 3 of the largest cities in this country looked at every sensor technology available and decided the most reliable early warning system they could install was a bluegill's nervous system, because that animal notices things the machines miss. That is not a simple fish. That is a fish with better information about its water than most of the equipment we built to replace it. And it is the same nervous system telling him, right now in August, exactly when the ants are falling, exactly where the oxygen is highest, and exactly which of your baits he can afford to ignore. Here is where I want an argument. I think the worst piece of bluegill advice on the internet right now is the one telling you to fish for them after dark under the lights. I think it is crappy advice with the wrong label on it. Prove me wrong. Give me the lake, give me the hour, and give me the biggest bluegill you have ever caught in full darkness. And one more. Have you ever smelled a bluegill bed? Half of you will say that is nonsense, and half of you will say you smelled one last June. Let us settle it in public. Everything in this video, plus the terrestrial insect calendar, the full filter table for all 15 baits, the day clock, the bed reading guide, And every source cited by name is in the free blueprint linked in the description. No email, no sign-up, nothing to buy. Download it, print it, take it in the boat. Go find the old ones. They are not where you were told they went.